The British committed a war crime. They classified it. They destroyed the records. They paid out bonuses. And for nearly 100 years, they pretended it never happened. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the archives. Today, I will tell you a story that isn't typically found in World War I textbooks. A story about ships that officially didn't exist. About people who officially weren't there. And about events that officially never took place. Q ships. Ever heard of them? It sounds like something out of a spy novel. Disguised vessels, hidden weaponry, double flags. Sounds clever, doesn't it? Almost noble. But behind this polished image lies something else entirely. A scandal of international proportions. American witnesses who couldn't be silenced. A ship that changed its name 3 times just to cover its tracks. And a decision that ultimately changed the outcome of the entire war. Just not in the way it was intended. Watch this video until the very last second. I promise, it's worth it. Picture the year 1914. The British Royal Navy is the strongest in the world. Hundreds of warships, decades of tradition, absolute confidence in its maritime supremacy. And then, on the horizon, a submarine appears. The British Admiralty's reaction was, to put it mildly, peculiar. Admiral Arthur Wilson, a former First Sea Lord, expressed the general mood of the command clearly. He called submarines underhanded, unfair, and damned un-English, adding that submarine crews should be hanged as pirates. That was their stance. You might think, well, those are just words. Perhaps there was a strategy or a countermeasures program behind them. No. The British simply didn't take the matter seriously. Why would they? Their battleships had ruled the seas for a century. Germany thought otherwise. By the start of World War I, the Germans had about 20 operational submarines. Not many by naval standards, but enough to teach a lesson. On September 22, 1914, just 7 weeks into the war, the German submarine U-9, under Kapitän Lieutenant Otto Weddigen, entered the North Sea. In 75 minutes, it sank 3 British armored cruisers, the Aboukir, the Hogue, and the Cressy. Nearly 1,400 sailors perished. 75 minutes, 3 warships. This wasn't a battle. It was an arithmetic lesson. And the British Admiralty learned it. But realizing there's a problem isn't the same as solving it. Meanwhile, German submarines ceased to be a rarity in the waters around the British Isles. They hunted merchant vessels, sank cargo, and severed supply lines. An island nation fed by imports felt what a naval blockade really meant. They needed an answer. Fast. Unexpected. Something the Germans wouldn't immediately guess. And someone in the Admiralty recalled an old principle. If the enemy is looking for easy prey, give them exactly what they are looking for. Only with something else inside. Thus was born an idea that became one of the British Navy's biggest secrets for years. Ships that looked like helpless merchantmen, but weren't. How exactly they worked, and who came up with this scheme, we are going to break down right now. Captain Gordon Campbell was an old-school naval officer, but he didn't think in an old-fashioned way. He is credited with developing a system that the British Admiralty officially classified, both from the enemy and from its own public. Later, after the war, Campbell wrote simply, "It should not be thought that the mysterious ships were some kind of wartime invention. Attempts to lure the enemy into a trap are as old as the hills. Deception is an ancient practice." An ancient practice, a new application. The vessels were designated Q ships, the Q likely coming from the Irish town of Queenstown, where the first such vessels began their operations. Now, for the practical side. On the outside, an ordinary shabby steamer, or a trawler, or a small cargo schooner. Nothing remarkable. These were exactly the vessels submarines were looking for. Slow, unarmed, easy prey. On the inside, everything was different. The main weapon? 12-pounder naval guns. To understand the scale, a shell from such a gun weighed about 5 kilograms, and the caliber reached 110 millimeters. This wasn't a light rifle, it was a serious naval cannon, capable of piercing a submarine hull from several hundred meters away. In addition, there were Maxim machine guns. All of this was hidden. The guns stood behind folding bulwarks, specifically made panels in the hull that would drop down at the right moment, revealing the cannon ready to fire. Other guns were hidden inside what appeared to be chicken coops or stacks of crates on deck. The ships were equipped with false funnels to alter their silhouette. The crew was twice as large as that of a regular merchant ship. But the extra men weren't visible. They stayed below and waited. And they truly knew how to wait. On board, there were panic parties. Groups of sailors whose task was to act like a panicked, fleeing crew when attacked. They would jump into lifeboats, shout loudly, and feign total chaos. All to ensure the submarine commander would think the ship was abandoned, surface, and approach. For the sake of realism, every detail was considered. Part of the crew wore women's clothing, so that among the refugees in the boats, female figures could be seen. Only the upper body, mind you. The lower half was hidden by the boat's side. It was enough. And one of the crews even had a cage with a stuffed parrot, to make the scene of a hurried evacuation look completely authentic. Funny? Only up to a certain point. In a single voyage, a ship could change its name, hull color, and national flag several times. Today, a Norwegian freighter. Tomorrow, a British trawler. The day after, something else. The men on these ships were volunteers, both naval sailors and civilians. They knew what they were getting into. The ship was intentionally placed in the line of fire, and the crew had to endure a torpedo or shell hit without revealing themselves prematurely. Nerves of steel is perhaps the mildest term for what was required of them. Now they needed a man to lead it all, a man with experience, with character, and preferably with a personal score to settle with the German submarine fleet. Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Herbert took command of the Q-ship Baralong in April 1915. He had every reason to hate German submarines. Not abstractly, truly. A few months earlier, he served on the British submarine D5. In November 1914, it hit a mine in the North Sea. Only 5 of the crew survived. Herbert was one of them. A man who went through that sees the war differently. On the Baralong, he set his own rules. No sir, only Captain McBride. That was the pseudonym he ordered to be used. A real naval officer on a merchant ship would look suspicious. The atmosphere on board was appropriate. A Q-ship crew wasn't a standard naval team with a strict code. Volunteers, merchant sailors mixed with military men, characters. They had to look like a ragtag bunch from a beat-up merchantman. Unshaven, sloppy, convincing. Once, a few crew members in a Dartmouth bar overdid the convincing part and trashed it. Herbert paid their bail, after which the Baralong quietly left the port. That tells you a lot about the man. But the spring of 1915 didn't provide a chance for a real operation. Voyage after voyage, and nothing. Submarines seemed to sense something, or just didn't cross their path. The crew waited. On May 7th, 1915, the wait was interrupted by a distress signal. The ship that sent it was called the Lusitania. You likely know the name. A British passenger liner sunk by the German U-20 that same day. Nearly 1,200 people died, including over 100 citizens of the United States of America. It became one of the most resonant events of the entire First World War. The Baralong responded and went to help. They arrived a few hours late. What exactly happened after the ship returned to port is hard to verify. There are accounts that 2 British intelligence officers visited Herbert and allegedly told him that the loss of the Lusitania had shocked society so much that from now on, German submarine crews should not be taken prisoner. These are unconfirmed reports, but what happened next is well documented. On August 19, 1915, the Baralong received distress signals from 2 ships simultaneously, the passenger liner Arabic and the cargo steamer Dunsley. Both were attacked. Herbert rushed to help and found no one. The distress signal had provided an incorrect position. By the time the Baralong reached the site, both ships were already at the bottom. One can only imagine what was going on aboard the ship that day. And then, on the same day, came a third signal. The third distress signal of the day came from the British cargo steamer Nicosian. The ship was coming from the United States. On board, cotton, lumber, canned meat. and several hundred mules for the needs of the British Army. A standard military cargo, a standard trade route. The German submarine U-27, under Captain Lieutenant Bernd Wegener, stopped the Nicosian and inspected it. This was the standard procedure according to prize rules, a set of maritime regulations that had existed long before the First World War. Prize rules required the attacking side to first inspect the vessel, give the crew time to evacuate, and only then sink it. Wegener acted strictly by the rules. The boarding party inspected the cargo. The Nicosian's crew was given time to move to the lifeboats. After that, U-27 began shelling the steamer's hull. At that moment, the Baralong appeared on the horizon. It was sailing under the American flag. The United States, in August 1915, hadn't yet entered the war and remained neutral. Their flag was the flag of a country not at war with either side. From the Baralong, a signal was hoisted. The vessel intended to pick up survivors from the boats. This was also a standard maritime gesture, a neutral ship wishing to help survivors. Wegener ceased fire. The Baralong continued to close in, passing behind the Nicosian's hull to be out of direct sight of the German submarine. It hoisted the British white ensign and emerged on the other side. The distance was short. The U-27 had no chance. The submarine was destroyed by artillery fire. Part of the German crew ended up in the water, including Captain Wegener himself, as well as the boarding party that hadn't managed to return to the sub before the attack began. And this is where the story takes a turn that the Admiralty desperately wanted to keep out of the spotlight. Some German sailors reached the Nicosian's side, up the rope ladders of the lifeboats still hanging from the steamer's hull. Herbert sent 12 Marines aboard, led by Corporal Collins. The German sailors were found in various parts of the ship. They didn't offer armed resistance. None of them survived. Captain Wegener was found in a bathroom in the captain's cabin. According to reports, he had raised his hands. It didn't help. The official version, which Herbert set out in his report, sounded different. The German sailors allegedly died from wounds sustained while escaping their sinking submarine, or were killed by the Nicosian's own engine room crew. It is impossible to determine for sure. The Admiralty received the report, read it, and immediately ordered it to be classified. But there was one problem the Admiralty didn't account for. On board the Nicosian were American citizens, muleteers hired in the United States to accompany the animals across the Atlantic. People who were entirely civilian, far from naval bureaucracy and British national interests. They saw everything. The British Admiralty knew how to keep secrets. Years of practice, well-oiled procedures, a clear understanding of what could be said publicly and what could not. When Herbert's report hit the leadership's desk, the decision was made quickly. Classify everything. Officially, no incident occurred. But the Admiralty failed to consider one circumstance. On board the Nicosian were American citizens, not military, not officials, just ordinary working people, muleteers hired in the United States to accompany the animals across the Atlantic. No non-disclosure agreements, no loyalty to the British Crown, no reason to keep quiet. And they didn't keep quiet. Herbert realized this immediately. Even before the Nicosian entered port, he personally appealed to the steamer's captain with a request to convince his crew and passengers not to talk about what they had seen. The captain, presumably, did his best. But the American muleteers could not be convinced. Information began to leak. First, talk in the ports. Then, more specific testimonies. And eventually, it all reached the American press. The Chicago American published a 5-part series, detailed, with eyewitness accounts, with details that simply didn't mesh with the official British version of a lawful naval battle. Imagine the situation. It's 1915. The United States is still neutral. Britain desperately needs American sympathy, American supplies, American money. The Lusitania has already become an international scandal in which Germany looks like the aggressor. And suddenly, publications stating that a British warship opened fire under a neutral American flag, and that after the battle, something else happened. It was a disaster for British diplomacy. The German side reacted immediately. They demanded a judicial trial for the perpetrators. Official appeals were sent, including to the authorities of the United States. After all, the incident directly concerned the American flag under which the Baralong operated. The result of these appeals was zero. It was wartime, and legal subtleties took a back seat. But the Admiralty understood. The problem wouldn't disappear on its own. So they launched an operation that can only be called the methodical destruction of evidence. First of all, the ship itself. The Baralong was renamed. The new name was Warandra. The vessel was moved from British waters to the Mediterranean, far away from journalists, witnesses, and uncomfortable questions. But even that didn't seem enough. The name Baralong was officially removed from Lloyd's Register, the main international shipping register where all merchant vessels in the world are recorded. Think about that. Lloyd's Register had existed since the 17th century. It recorded ships, their routes, their owners. It was an official document of international level. And the British Admiralty succeeded in having the ship's name simply struck from it. In 1916, the ship received yet another name, Manica. The tracks were being covered consistently and neatly. The Nicosian, the steamer alongside which it all happened, was also renamed. It became the Nicosian, just in case someone tried to find a link between the names in the documents. But the most telling step concerned the people. The entire Baralong crew was issued new service record books. These are documents that track a sailor's entire service, every voyage, every port, every ship. In the new books, the voyage of August 19, 1915, simply didn't exist. It wasn't classified. It wasn't marked confidential. It just didn't happen. The men who were on board that day were officially not there. The ship that took part in the battle was officially not in that area. The incident, which the American press wrote about, officially didn't happen. This wasn't just military secrecy. This was rewriting history in retrospect. And you know what the most interesting part is? The Baralong's crew received a cash bonus for that voyage. 185 pounds sterling per man. That was a lot of money by 1915 standards, roughly a year's wages for a skilled worker, for an operation that officially didn't exist. Germany, meanwhile, drew its own conclusions. Not from an investigation, there wasn't one. From the very fact of what happened. If the enemy acts this way, the rules of prize law, to stop, to inspect the ship, to give the crew time to evacuate, turn from a norm of naval warfare into a death sentence for one's own crew. Germany's response was systematic, and it changed the entire naval war. But before talking about that response, one more episode needs to be told, because the Baralong managed to strike again, under a different command, and again under a neutral flag. After the Nicosian incident, Godfrey Herbert was transferred from the Baralong to another assignment. This could have been interpreted as a consequence of what happened, but in all likelihood, it was a normal rotation of command. His place was taken by the ship's first officer, Lieutenant Commander Andrew Wilmot Smith. The ship remained the same, the tactics remained the same, and the flag, too. A month and 5 days passed. On September 24, 1915, the Baralong was at sea when the crew noticed a sinking ship. It was the British steamer Urbino. Nearby, lifeboats with the crew were rowing away, meaning the attack had already occurred. Somewhere nearby, a submarine had to be. It was found quickly. The German submarine U-41, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hansen, was in a surface position near the site of the Urbino's sinking. And again, an important detail. The U-41 was acting according to prize rules. The Urbino had been stopped, inspected, and the crew had been given time to leave the ship. Everything was within the framework of established maritime order. Now, before Hansen appeared, the Baralong, under the American flag. Hansen did exactly what the regulations required when encountering a neutral ship in a war zone. He demanded that the Baralong send a boat with ship's documents for inspection. This was standard procedure, to ensure that it was indeed a neutral ship, and not a warship under a false flag. Aboard the Baralong, they feigned activity. The crew acted as if they were fiddling with a boat, slowly, awkwardly, unable to lower it into the water. A common scene on a small merchant vessel with a less than expert crew. While this went on, the Baralong continued to close in on the submarine. When the distance became short enough, the bulwarks dropped. The American flag was still hoisted at the moment the fire was opened. U-41 was destroyed. According to reports, only 2 survivors from the German crew were pulled from the water. 2 out of the entire submarine crew. Stop for a second and think about this. The first incident, the Nicosian in August, could, with a great stretch of imagination, be explained as a coincidence. Tension, Herbert's personal history, the visit from intelligence officers and their alleged instructions. 1 man, 1 day, 2 previous devastating misses in a row. This could be explained. Not justified, but explained. The second incident could not. A different commander, a different submarine, a different victim. But the same scheme. A neutral flag until the very last moment. Simulation of a peaceful ship's actions. Fire from point-blank range. This wasn't the improvisation of a man under extreme pressure on a bad day. This was a well-honed tactic. Wilmot Smith received a cash bonus, £170 sterling. A bit less than what the Baralong crew got for the Nicosian, but a comparable sum. And here, it is worth saying something that clearly shows how military history is structured. Andrew Wilmot Smith lived until the end of the war. In 1919, he was awarded Britain's highest military decoration, the Victoria Cross. But not for U-41. For a completely different operation, the British torpedo boat attack on the Soviet Navy in Kronstadt in August 1919. The war ended. The next one began. But let's return to 1915, because the Baralong story has another layer that is important to understand. After the second incident, the Admiralty again busied itself with documents. This time, preventively, without waiting for leaks. The ship already bore a new name, Weirandra, after being renamed in September. But that wasn't enough. In 1916, it received yet another name, Manica. 2 renamings in a year and a half. Each time, new documents, new records, a new trail that disappeared into thin air. If you try to trace this ship's history in official British naval documents of that period, you will encounter a curious picture. Records appear and disappear. Names change. Voyages fall out. This doesn't look like accidental administrative errors. This looks like work. Now, the important question that often remains in the shadows of this story. Germany knew what had happened. The German side had evidence, if only because the 2 survivors from U-41 were pulled on board and became prisoners of war. They could talk, and they did. The German naval staff analyzed both incidents together, the August and September ones, and came to a conclusion that completely changed the strategy of submarine warfare. Prize rules, surfacing, inspecting the ship, giving the crew time to evacuate, only worked if both sides observed them. If one side used these rules as bait, then for a submarine, surfacing next to any merchant ship became potentially lethal. The logic was ironclad. And the conclusion, too. Germany announced a shift to unrestricted submarine warfare. From now on, merchant vessels in war zones could be sunk without warning, without stopping, without giving the crew time to evacuate. From a submerged position, without surfacing. The British created Q ships to force submarines to surface. The submarines stopped surfacing. The trap stopped working at the exact moment its creators decided that the rules of war were only for everyone else. Before talking about what the German side changed, we need to address an important detail. Unrestricted submarine warfare isn't an invention of autumn 1915. Germany had declared it back on February 4th, 1915, 6 months before the Nicosian incident. Waters around the British Isles were declared a war zone, where any merchant vessel could be attacked without warning. But this declaration faced a serious obstacle: the United States of America, the largest neutral trading partner whose ships traveled into European waters, whose citizens died alongside the sunk passenger liners. President Woodrow Wilson made it clear: if Germany continued to sink ships with American citizens on board, the diplomatic consequences would be severe. After the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, pressure on Berlin increased to such an extent that the German side made concessions. In September 1915, right during the period when both Baralong incidents occurred, Germany effectively scaled back unrestricted submarine warfare. Submarine commanders were ordered to return to prize rules regarding passenger vessels. And here's where the Baralong and its story come in. The German side collected testimonies from the survivors of U-41, the two who were pulled from the water. Added to them were reports on the August incident with the U-27, leaked through the American press. And they obtained an argument that was hard to dispute. The British demanded that German submariners observe prize rules, to surface, to inspect ships, to give crews time to abandon ship. The British insisted on these rules publicly, officially, in diplomatic correspondence. While doing so, a British warship twice in August and September 1915, opened fire on German submarines that were exactly observing these very rules. And both times did so under a neutral flag. Germany sent these materials to neutral countries, not just as a diplomatic protest, as an argument in the dispute over who observes the rules in this war and who does not. And this argument carried weight. Now, imagine yourself as a German submarine commander in late 1915. You have received an order to observe prize rules. This means you must surface next to a merchant vessel, give it time to stop, conduct an inspection. All this, on the surface, immobile for several minutes, while knowing that a few months ago, two of your comrades did exactly that and died, because the ship they were inspecting turned out to be a warship under a false flag. How do you feel? The answer to that question determined the further course of the war. January 1917. The German Imperial Naval Staff made the final decision. Effective February 1st, 1917, full unrestricted submarine warfare would resume. Any merchant vessel in the established zones sunk without warning, without stopping, without surfacing. The calculation was direct and harsh. German analysts estimated if at least 600,000 tons of British merchant shipping were sunk monthly, Britain would find itself in a critical position in about 6 months. An island nation that depended on maritime supplies of food, raw materials, and military goods simply wouldn't withstand that rate of loss. In February 1917, German submarines sank 540,000 tons of Allied shipping. In March, 593,000 tons. In April, 860,000 tons. To understand what this figure means, in April 1917, one ship was going to the bottom roughly every 2 hours. Britain found itself in a severe crisis. Grain stocks dropped to a 6-week level. The Admiralty considered withdrawing from the war. But Germany miscalculated one thing. The declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare meant that American ships were now also in the line of fire, officially, without exceptions. President Wilson, who for 3 years had balanced between neutrality and pressure from warring sides, found himself in a position where neutrality became impossible. On April 6, 1917, the United States of America declared war on Germany. This changed everything. American troops, American industry, American resources, all of this now worked against Germany. The war that the German staff expected to win in 6 months through a naval blockade acquired a new dimension. But back to the Q-ships, because this is where the story makes one more turn that explains the final statistics of the program. After the transition to unrestricted submarine warfare, German submarine commanders changed their tactics. No more surfacing next to an unknown merchant ship. No closing to a distance from which a Q-ship could open aimed fire. A torpedo from a submerged position from a safe distance, and away. The trap, which worked by having the victim approach closely, stopped receiving victims. But the German response wasn't limited to changing submarine tactics. There was another component that is discussed significantly less often. Germany armed its own merchant vessels and began turning them into raiders, surface ships that hunted Allied merchant shipping across all oceans. Unlike British Q-ships, German raiders operated openly, under the German naval flag. This was lawful according to international maritime law. The most successful was the auxiliary cruiser Möwe. Over 2 raids in 1915 to 1916 and 1916 to 1917, it sank or captured 38 Allied merchant vessels with a total displacement of about 174,000 tons. It operated in the Atlantic, reaching the shores of South America. The auxiliary cruiser Wolf set out in November 1916 and returned only in February 1918, 15 months at sea. During that time, it sank or captured 35 ships in the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. They searched for it and didn't find it. There was even a sailing schooner, Seidler, under the command of Count Felix von Luckner, a 3-masted sailing ship disguised as a Norwegian merchant vessel. During 8 months of sailing, it destroyed 16 Allied vessels without losing a single man from the crews of the captured ships. Note the difference. British Q-ships used a false flag, disguised themselves as helpless merchantmen, lured the enemy, and opened fire. This was a secret war with the violation of identification marks. German raiders operated under their own naval flag. Yes, they also used camouflage to close in, but at the moment of the attack, they hoisted the German flag. Legally, it was a different situation. Someone might say, it's hypocrisy. War is war. But this exact difference mattered in a diplomatic context, and it determined which side could appeal to international norms, and which could not. Meanwhile, the British Q-ship program continued to work, or tried to work. By 1917, German submariners had developed methods for identifying Q-ships. Too steady a gait for a beat-up merchantman. Too fast a lowering of lifeboats upon being hit by a shell. Real panic looks different. Too deep a draft for a ship supposedly going empty. Mismatch between the declared cargo and the ship's behavior in the waves. The hunter and the prey learned from each other, and the score became increasingly less favorable for the British side. Let's talk about the numbers. Not because numbers are boring, but because numbers provide the answer to the question posed in the title of this video. Who won? Immediately, a disclaimer that American researchers who studied this topic make. Due to the extremely secret nature of the operations, problems with identifying vessels, and the intentional confusing of documents, all figures provided are approximate. That's not my disclaimer. It's an honest warning from historians who worked with the archives. So, over the entire First World War, from 1914 to 1918, a total of 193 vessels were converted into Q-ships. Of different sizes, of different types. Colliers, trawlers, schooners, small steamers. All of them, at various times, patrolled the waters around the British Isles and other areas. Of these 193 ships, 38 were lost. Every 5th Q-ship didn't return from its mission. Now, the main figure. Throughout the war, Q-ships definitively destroyed 15 German submarines. Another 4 destructions are considered unreliable, meaning there is no full certainty of the Q-ship's involvement. 15 submarines, 38 sunk Q-ships. You might say, so what? A ship is cheaper than a submarine. Maybe it was still a profitable trade? Let's break this down. A German U-19 type submarine, a common type for that period, cost the German treasury approximately 1,800,000 gold marks. It was a complex combat machine with a crew of about 30, diesel engines, torpedo tubes, and a naval gun. A Q-ship is a converted merchant steamer or trawler. The cost of conversion is incomparable to the cost of building a combat submarine. But it's not just about money. Over those same years, German submarines destroyed thousands of merchant vessels. In 1917 alone, the most difficult for British shipping, they sank over 6 million tons of Allied merchant fleet. 6 million tons. Q-ships throughout the entire war destroyed 15 submarines. This isn't a turning point in the war. This is a drop in the ocean. But let's look at the dynamics, because hidden within them is something important. In 1915, when the program was just unfolding, and German submariners didn't yet know what to expect, Q-ships achieved their greatest successes. It was during this period that U-27 and U-41 were destroyed, the ones we already talked about. The element of surprise worked. In 1916, the results were more modest. German commanders started to be more cautious. In 1917, the picture flipped completely. In that year alone, Q-ships destroyed 6 German submarines, but they lost 24 vessels themselves. 24 against 6. And here is the most telling detail. Just in 1 month, August 1917, 5 Q-ships were lost. 1 month, 5 ships. Think about what that meant for the people on board. Q-ship crews were volunteers who went on missions knowing that their ship was intentionally attracting enemy fire, that they would be shot at, and they had to endure it without revealing themselves too early. This required a very specific character type, and in August 1917, 5 such crews didn't return. Why did everything flip like this? German submariners learned. They had concrete signs by which a Q-ship could be identified in the open sea. The first, the ship's behavior when hit. When a torpedo or shell hits a real merchant steamer, panic looks a certain way. People scramble, lifeboats are lowered with errors. Everything happens awkwardly and slowly. On Q-ships, the panic party was too well prepared, too coordinated, too fast and correct a lowering of lifeboats. The second sign, the draft. A ship supposedly going empty or with a light load should sit in the water a certain way. A Q-ship with guns, ammunition, and an increased crew on board was heavier than it should have been for the declared cargo. An experienced eye noticed the mismatch. The third sign, behavior when encountering a submarine. A real merchant captain, upon seeing a submarine, tries to escape or heaves to. A Q-ship behaved a little differently, kept a course that ensured an advantageous position for firing. This doesn't mean every German commander could recognize a trap at first glance, but caution became the norm, and caution killed the very concept. A Q-ship worked only when the submarine approached closely enough. If a submarine fired a torpedo from a distance of several hundred meters from a submerged position, the trap didn't trigger. The guns behind folding bulwarks were useless against a target that couldn't be seen. And here it is important to say something that official British reports spoke of reluctantly. The Q-ship program, in terms of destroying submarines, failed. Not partially, completely. The submarine war was won by entirely different means. The convoy system, where merchant ships moved in groups under the protection of warships, proved incomparably more effective. The Admiralty resisted its introduction until nearly the middle of 1917, believing that convoys only made it easier for submarines to find targets. When the system was finally introduced, losses of the merchant fleet began to drop. Depth charges, charges that exploded at a set depth, gave hunters of submarines a weapon that worked against underwater targets. In 1916, their use was still a rarity. By 1918, they became standard equipment for escort ships. Aviation, maritime patrol aircraft, and airships began to control the airspace over convoy routes. A submarine on the surface, spotted from the air, lost its main advantage: invisibility. Hydrophones, devices for listening to underwater sounds, allowed detecting submarines moving in a submerged state. None of these means had any relation to Q-ships. So why did the program continue until the end of the war? Here begins the realm where documents say one thing, but between the lines you read another. Officially, Q-ships tied up German submarines, forced them to act more cautiously, diverted resources. That is true, but only partially. Unofficially, by 1917, the program lived largely by inertia. It existed, had a command, had people, had a budget. To admit its failure meant admitting that 3 years of effort, 38 lost ships, and hundreds of lost lives gave a result incomparable to the costs. In wartime, it is difficult to decide to do that. And yet, the result was exactly that. 193 ships, 38 sunk, 15 destroyed submarines. Against these figures, German submarines destroyed about 5,000 Allied merchant ships throughout the war. 5,000 against 15. If this was a war, the score in it is unambiguous. But this story has one final level, the most unexpected one. Because the impact of Q ships on the war's outcome turned out to be enormous. Just not in the way it was planned. Back to where we started. An inconspicuous steamer in the open sea. Shabby, slow, completely uninteresting. That is exactly how it was supposed to look. Behind that facade, a gun was hidden, ready for battle, and a crew ready to wait as long as needed. Now you know what was inside, and now we can ask the main question. Did it work? If the answer is 15 destroyed submarines against 38 lost Q ships, then the answer is obvious. No, it didn't work. Not as intended. But there is another question, a more important one. What did this program actually change? The British Admiralty in 1914 looked at submarines as a second-rate weapon. Unworthy. Unfair. Captain Lieutenant Wegener in August 1915 acted strictly by the rules. Stopped the ship, gave the crew time to evacuate, began shelling only after that. He observed the very rules that the British side officially supported, and that is exactly what killed him. There is no simple villain and simple hero here. There is a system in which each subsequent step logically followed from the previous one. Germany started the submarine war. Britain invented the trap. The trap required a false flag. A false flag required hiding the evidence. Hiding the evidence required rewriting documents. And when all this became known, Germany concluded that the rules no longer worked, and canceled them. And it was this conclusion, not 15 sunk submarines, but the cancellation of the rules, that became the main result of the Q-ship program. Unrestricted submarine warfare, which began in February 1917, sank nearly 1 million tons of Allied shipping in April of that same year. It brought Britain to the brink of a severe crisis with supplies. And it also drew the United States of America into the war, because sinking American ships without warning was now official German policy. The entry of the United States of America into the war in April 1917 changed its outcome. Follow the chain. Q ships used a neutral American flag as a weapon. Germany, in response, stopped surfacing and started sinking everyone. American ships and citizens began to die systematically. Wilson declared war. Germany lost. Can it be said that Q ships influenced the outcome of the First World War? Yes, just not as planned. Now, about the people. Because behind all these figures and strategic schemes were living people who went to sea every day on a ship specifically designed to attract enemy fire. Volunteers. Every single one of them. None of them were obligated to be there. Merchant sailors who could have chosen a safe trade route. Naval officers who could have served on a regular warship. They chose it themselves. What drove them is hard to say definitively. Money. The bonuses were large. Excitement. The atmosphere on those ships was far from a strict naval code. Belief. There was a war on, and people were fighting. Probably all of that together. Godfrey Herbert lived until the end of the war. In 1919, he received the rank of commander. His official biography mentions the events of August and September 1915, but presented, as you might guess, quite reservedly. Gordon Campbell, the man credited with developing the entire concept of Q ships, became one of the most decorated British officers of the First World War. He received the Victoria Cross, the Order of the Bath, and several other awards. After the war, he wrote a book about his experience commanding Q ships. The book became popular. It, of course, contained nothing about the American muleteers and the Chicago American newspaper. The Q-ship program officially ended with the war in November 1918. Most ships returned to civilian life, changed their name again, painted themselves in peaceful colors, and went to carry ordinary cargo along ordinary routes. No folding bulwarks, no hidden guns, no panic parties, just ships. Lloyd's Register never restored the entry for the Baralong under its original name during the war period. Officially, this ship seemed not to exist in those months. And here, a final observation I want to leave you with. The British Admiralty, at the very beginning of this story, called submarines a dishonorable weapon, a weapon unworthy of a civilized war, a weapon that operates underhandedly without showing its true face. Then, the British created ships that operated underhandedly, hid their true face, hoisted a foreign flag, looked like one thing, but were another, then destroyed the documents about it, then paid out bonuses. Who won in this war of Q-ships and submarines? If you count by sunk ships, submarines won by a huge margin. If you count by the consequences, the picture is more complex. Q-ships didn't win the war at sea, but they changed the rules of that war, and the changes reverberated far beyond what the British Admiralty had planned. And a rusty steamer in the open sea, with a stuffed parrot on deck, with a gun behind a fake chicken coop, and with people who knew how to wait, remained in history as one of the most unusual military experiments of the 20th century.